nicely. In other words, the logic is, we are close to you. Now, these are the collaborating Israelites, right? And they are trying to establish their close relationship with Pharaoh by using this word servant. So that's what they're doing. In other words, they're really ramping up their own position by using the word servant. So it's not that servant is a complete underling, someone oppressed. Rather, Pharaoh needs to treat them nicely. So when you actually look at the ratio, it's pretty remarkable that there are so many more occurrences of the word servant referring to the Egyptians than to the Israelites. But what we find is there are some occurrences where we have that God brought the Israelites out of the house of Avadim, the plural of Eved. Many different occurrences of this, particularly in Deuteronomy, it has to be said, not in the book of Exodus. But this is where one of the occurrences in the book of Exodus. Moses said to the people, "Remember this day in which you came out from Egypt, out of the house of slavery." That's how it's translated, but actually it's the plural of the word Eved. For by a strong hand the Lord brought you out of this place. And when we read the house of slavery, we think of it quite easily. We think of it, well, the Israelites are slaves in the land of Egypt. There might have been other people slaves in the land of Egypt, and they've been brought out of that slavery. But I think there's a question in the text. Who are the real slaves in the land of Egypt? Are in fact some of the Egyptians part of that house of slavery? That is, when the Israelites are out, there is still this serving of Pharaoh going on. It's also translated sometimes house of bondage. Literally, it's the house of Ardim. Well, who were they? The obvious answer is Israel were the people, the Avadim in this particular case. And one justification would be the text I've already mentioned from Deuteronomy, not from Exodus. From Deuteronomy, we find that it is said, "We were Pharaoh's slaves, Avadim, in Egypt." There are other references to that. The Passover festival in the liturgy there, it says, "We were brought out from slavery to freedom." But there's a more complicated answer. And this is what we get, I think, from reading Genesis and Exodus. This is what God says to Pharaoh through Moses. "Israel is my firstborn son, and I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son." Pharaoh's great error was making someone else's son work for him. And in fact, what we see is another theme going on in the book of Genesis, and this is in chapter 47. I'm going to read an extended passage. This is what happens when Joseph is in charge of the land of Egypt. When the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone." And Joseph answered, "Give your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock, if your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. He supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. When that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent. The herd of our livestock are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh. And give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, and for all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made them servants of them, from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you. You shall sow the land, and at the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the fields, and as food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones." And they said, "You saved our lives. May it please my lord, we will be servants to Pharaoh." So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, sorry, got a footnote in there, and they gained possessions in it. and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. Who are the freeholders in the land of Egypt? It's the Israelites. So what we see is a rather remarkable thing. Now this also fits with another set of themes in the book of Genesis. And that is the whole idea of a consequence chain. That one thing happens and then something else happens as a result. So for instance, we find that the patriarch Jacob tricks his father Isaac with a goat skin that he is his older brother. Is that the end of the story? No, because what's going to happen is then his father-in-law is going to trick him that the older sister is the younger sister. Jacob's father, Isaac, was blind. So Jacob's father-in-law tricks Jacob in the dead of night, because everyone's blind then. Then we find that Laban can't get away with his trickery because he has to be tricked by the daughter he tricked against. And so Rachel refuses to get up when she has stolen the household gods. But that's not the end of the story, because then we find that the sons of Leah particularly trick Jacob with goat's blood of all things to sell, and they end up selling their brother Joseph to the Egyptians. Then we find one of the chief sons of Leah, the daughter that was tricked with by Laban, is tricked by his daughter-in-law, and the whole thing involves a goat, because Tamar dresses up as a prostitute, and you know the rest of the story. Genesis 38, good read. Then we find that, of course, Joseph ends up tricking his brothers about his identity, and in the end of it all, Joseph buys the Egyptians. Why does Joseph buy the Egyptians? Because they had the nerve to buy him in the first place. So in other words, we find a whole chain of things. And that's part of the background to how we got to read Exodus. And the book of Exodus is telling us more than one thing. The Israelites, yes, they are serving the Egyptians with really hard service. They're having to work very hard. They're not free. I would agree in that way, and we can read it legitimately as saying the Israelites are slaves in the land of Egypt. That's what Deuteronomy 6 verse 21 says. But that's not the whole story. There's another side of the story. And in that we realize that also the Egyptians themselves are not free. Pharaoh and his henchmen, don't you think that's the life of free people? And in fact, what are the Israelites to do? They are to come out of Egypt and serve God. And you know the root serve, ayin beit dalet in Hebrew, is used more for what the Israelites go to outside the land of Egypt than what they were doing inside the land of Egypt. They are to serve God. They are to worship God. Him only shall you serve. Even the Passover is called their avodah, the same Hebrew roots coming up. As it says right at the beginning, Exodus chapter 3, that when they come out, they shall serve God on the mountain. Again and again and again and again, we see this word serve. And that's the way we need to realize that when we read back through Leviticus 25 again, we read that they are servants belonging to God. So then we get to John chapter 8. And there we have a lot of irony in John's gospel, but this is what we have in an exchange between Jesus and the Jews. Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, "If you abide in my word, you're truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." They answered, "We're offspring of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it you say you'll become free?" Well, that's an interesting reading of the Old Testament, never been enslaved to anyone. Of course, you think, well, haven't you read Exodus either? But maybe they're reading Exodus in this way. And what we realize is that actually, have they been slaves? Well, it all depends. If they have been children of God, if they have been serving him throughout this, well, arguably, they've never actually been truly anyone as slaves. It's just perhaps that Pharaoh thought they were his slaves, but not really. And the truth will set you free. Well, let's come on now to the New Testament. You see, if the Old Testament talks about people being slaves and it doesn't seem to set them all free, what about the New Testament? Well, I've already argued that the Old Testament can be properly understood as permissive law. That what we have in the Old Testament is sometimes regulating something rather than saying this is ideal. But what about the New Testament? Well, firstly, the idea that the Christians in the New Testament could all change slavery is rather naive, because let's remember that back then they had no votes. So they couldn't just change the legal system. So for Paul to write to them in letters about what the ideal legal system would have been, writing something a bit like Plato's Republic, would have been no help whatsoever to people leading their lives. Moreover, telling slaves to rebel would simply end up with them being executed, probably by crucifixion. That would help nothing. The Romans would certainly win against the slave rebellion that had been tried in the days of Spartacus. But in fact, there are legal limits to how many slaves anyone could free. Paul could say, masters, free your slaves, but if they'd tried to free their slaves, they would not have been free, because of the lex fufia caninia, for instance, which said if you have 3 slaves, you can only free 2 of them. If you have 10 slaves, you can only free 5 of them. If you have 30 slaves, you can only free 10 of them. Moreover, because of another law, the lex aelia sentia, it could be the case that actually by being freed too early, you would suffer some disadvantage. Because if you got freed before 30, it would be very, very hard to become a citizen and so on. So what we find is we might sit in our armchairs and think, oh, Paul should have written and said, masters, free your servants, free your slaves. But they would not have been free. If they'd tried to do it, they would not all have been legally free. Those people would actually have been quite vulnerable. What's more, what does the New Testament teach? Well, it can't change the political system, but what it can do is it can say this: we should love others as Christ loved us. Now, enacting that one command on its own abolishes the whole thing, because if you start treating others as Christ loved you, and you think about how much Christ loved you, and how he actually gave himself as the servant for us, as in Philippians 2, then actually that we could only do that by becoming other people's servants. You see? So in other words, that on its own, if people just took that to heart, it would abolish the idea of compelling someone else to be your servant. But further than that, it also teaches the brotherhood, the sisterhood, the siblinghood of those who are following Christ. They're to treat each other as brother and sister. They start using the word bro and sister in a context where those terms are not being used regularly. They're asserting familyness, they're asserting kinship in this grouping of the church. And they do more than that. They also have a kissing campaign. Now, what goes on in the kissing campaign? It's mentioned in the Holy Kiss in Paul's letters, but also in 1 Peter. So it's not just one particular group. And people say, yes, wasn't it part of the ancient culture to greet each other with a kiss? No. It was not part of the ancient culture that a slave would kiss a master, or that a Jew would kiss a Gentile. It was totally scandalous. Isn't it obvious that it's scandalous? The idea that you would kiss across those ethnic groups, across those social boundaries, scandalous. Whom do you kiss? You kiss your family, you kiss your siblings. In other words, it's not just that they use this brotherhood language, just the words, mere words. It's actually something active. It's something where they, as they meet together, you see all these different social classes, and they have to undertake this kissing campaign. I mean, it's compulsory kissing. If we have compulsory kissing today, or you want to have the holy kiss, maybe your pastor sort of think about reintroducing it in a family, in your church, do start with kissing the people you least want to kiss. That's part of the point of the holy kiss, that you actually make sure that people realize that across those boundaries, we're saying we are one in Christ. And how would Romans have looked at that? People in the Roman Empire, they would have been scandalized by the immorality that all of those boundaries that they had been so careful in putting into place are being broken down. It's like fraternizing across the ranks in the army or something like that. It's just something terrible. You know, that you would try and break down those things. We put all of this effort into maintaining this hierarchy in society, and what are you doing with it? Just breaking it down. And then we see the language of Paul's letters, where he says to masters in Ephesians 6 that they are to give the same to their servants. Well, is that the same as they give to themselves? Or is it in fact the same amongst their servants, or in fact not the same as they give to themselves? And they're told not to threaten. Well, if they're not to threaten, they're certainly not hitting them hard either. You see? They're not to threaten. And they're told God doesn't prefer masters. Or as it says in Colossians, they are to give what's right and equal. We find equality language here. In other words, not just equal amongst themselves, but also equal to what you're giving yourself. Or as Philemon is told, he is to receive Onesimus, probably a runaway slave, back no longer as a slave, but above a slave, a beloved brother. And then through all of this, what's their favorite song? What's the thing they're calling out in their services all the time? Well, it's Jesus is Lord, Kurios. And that word Lord doesn't just mean Lord, it's also the word for master. So who's the name of the person they're worshipping? He's called Master Jesus Christ. You get the idea. They're not just saying, that he's Lord in some sort of worship sense. They're actually saying he is the boss. And that relativizes anyone else's claim to be boss. It makes you look out, as you look out at a church where there are some who in Roman terms are masters, others who in Roman terms are slaves. Well, they're kissing each other, they're sitting next to each other, they're embracing each other as brothers and sisters, and they're saying, we follow the Master Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is my master. And when you realize, of course they can't abolish Roman slavery, they're not in a political situation to do that. But what they can do is they can start a new society. In fact, a new ethnic group. Arguably, when you're asked your citizenship, if you're American or even Texan, you should not say American, Texan. You should put Christian. That's actually your citizenship. Now, I'm not saying you should actually fill that in the form. There is a particular thing they intend you to fill in. You should probably put that in. But what I mean is, in reality, our most fundamental identity, our ethnicity, is that we are in Christ. And what these people did is they started a new society, a new race. They're sometimes described as a new race that's come abroad in the Roman Empire, the Christians. And that's what they do. Of course, they can't change the Roman law. They can start a new society within the Roman Empire, which has its own rules, and which there is no slavery. And everyone who's in that society is free from sin and a slave and a servant of the best master there could possibly be. Thanks very much for listening.
Okay, occurrences, in reference to the occurrences of slave, the word. Who's doing these translations and revisions?
Well, I mean, there are various people on committees that produce these, but I don't think there's anything malign in what's going on. As I said, one of the changes, I think, is the two world wars, which actually had a big change, certainly in Britain, where you go from a much more hierarchical society to a less hierarchical society. Which means that terms like manservant, maidservant, bondservant, these all sound very archaic. And actually people try and simplify that. Nowadays, you don't even have servants. I mean, you may have people who work in your house like servants, but you call them your cook, your au pair. You use any term other than the word servant. If you use the word servant to them, they will feel pretty insulted. And so that's where we've got to realize there have been some changes going on, and I think the translators are trying to respond to that. They're looking at making translations less archaic. They find these old words like manservant, and they think, what does that mean? It means the word slave, and so that's what they do. There's nothing sinister about it, but there is a consequence to that. So, if we think about the King James Version, the interesting thing is that was made in 1611. Arguably, slavery began in North America in 1619, so it's just 8 years later, and so it's worth thinking about how there is that time gap. They are writing at a time when none of that's happened. They're translating at a time when none of that's happened. But it's just interesting to think about. For us, the word slave is a very important word. I find it a very good word to describe political realities, but a very, very poor term when it comes to analyzing substance. Because actually, I do believe that sometimes it can be right for people to be forced to work. I don't think there are many situations in which that's the case. The terrible thing about what went on in New World slavery was the sheer oppression, injustice, and everything about it. The whole thing stinks. But just narrowly isolating the question of can someone in a particular circumstance be morally made to work for someone else I don't necessarily have a problem in every circumstance. There might be very few circumstances we come across today, but in the cases of crimes and so on, I don't have a problem with that.
Okay, so is Jesus Lord or King?
Yes.
Should someone be fixing these translations?
Yes.
Since you're on the English Standard Version Committee, can we expect that to be done soon?
No.
Might you know the percentage of slaves in the ancient societies of Israel, Rome, or the southern U.S.?
Arguably, they're reasonably similar. The way you get the ancient possible slavery numbers in the Old Testament, and this is where we get onto the subject of numbers in the Old Testament, where Mark and I have some different perspectives. But actually, we have a census that goes on in the days of David, and we also know how many people Solomon drafted in order to do his construction. Now, Solomon's actually described as being pretty oppressive to people. It's interesting that as he does the draft, it's I think it's 1 month on and 2 months off, which is quite an interesting thing because it's not actually as oppressive as it could be, but in relative terms, he was oppressive. And you do get to something close to 20% which is not that dissimilar to what you'd find with other settings. But I think actually Solomon is not set up as an ideal in that sense. He is described as walking in all the ways of David his father, which is different from walking in all the ways of the law of Moses, isn't it?
Okay, slave of all, subject to none, dutiful servant of all, and slave to all, Galatians 3. Can you please explain the different uses by Paul?
Well, one of the things Paul's doing is he's writing to people who are in contexts where there are many slaves, many free people in Roman context. And he uses the words free and slave of everyone. So in Romans, we see how he will say you can be slave to sin, free from God, or you can be free from sin and a slave of God. And so these categories apply in every way. He also uses slave language of the way we should submit ourselves to others. So this is clear in Philippians, where we are to have the same mind which is in Christ, who took on the very form of a servant, using the word doulos there in Greek, where that is actually a path to follow, that we are, just as it says in the Gospels, the Son of Man came to serve, not to be served. So I think there are all sorts of ways that Paul's using this. But you've got to remember that these are not statements of the absolute. They're statements of which are trying to help us grasp some of what's going on. But the underlying direction of things is that those who are in Christ are going to go into this enormous inheritance with Christ. And there is this sense, as we have in the Old Testament, where Joshua brought the children of Israel into their inheritance. We have the same sense in the New Testament that people are going to inherit them. You know, as Christ says, the meek will inherit the earth. So there is that. There's not a sense that you will, as you give yourself up and as you serve others, that will be a situation of everlasting pain. In fact, rather, it's a situation that just as Christ gave up his situation and served and received a name above all names, so we, as we follow in his path, there is a crown and an inheritance for those who do that.
Okay, lightning round.
Okay.
In the Old Testament law, were successive generations of a person who was in servitude automatically placed in servitude themselves?
Probably. So I think with the non-Israelites, it's not clear to me that the Jubilee worked, as in the Jubilee seems to me specifically for Israelites. However, I think we need to understand that there are, I would say that as regulating law, and also that these people have real religious access and privilege, the Nethinim, arguably in the temple, who are in that sort of servitude, need to be understood as people having some privileges.
If buying a slave was actually buying a lease on a person's future work in the Old Testament, was there always the assumption that a time period was set for their servitude?
I don't think so. And I think one of the reasons why is we've got to think of a different culture in which everyone is tied to a family somewhere. And so just as in a feudal system in the Middle Ages in Britain, it would be very hard for many of these people to imagine themselves outside of that. A lot of people wouldn't really have desired. I mean, if you're in Abraham's house, I don't think you would necessarily have desired to be anywhere else. So that's where I think we've got to understand, just as many people take up all sorts of forms of employment today, that the Old Testament law says if if someone wants to run away, you give them a place because they clearly had a very hard time. But actually, that's not the general rule.
Are corporate visa sponsorships or the foreign domestic help arrangements where you give someone room, board, limited pay, 1 day off per month, similar to Old Testament slavery?
I think some of them will be similar to some of the situations that pertain for particular individuals. Yes, these are household dependents. Nowadays, we're in a very individualistic context where we don't think of people outside of households and we all just pursue our own employment. But I think that can be an analogy, but you want to make sure you don't push the analogy too far.
Okay, I love these questions. What some people think of is just really cool. So this is just a practical question. Peter Williams, which do you believe to be worse? Slavery, as practiced in the Old Testament, or self-imposed slavery to success, power, wealth, popularity, especially in Western culture? Which would you choose?
Well, I mean, I think that if you're going to look at the long-term thing, what shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? By far the worst thing would be if being a slave of sin, being a slave of your own ambitions and so on, the eternal consequences of that are far worse than being, at someone else's command.
Amen. Okay, this person may have meant, I don't understand, they may not listen to Bob Dylan, Jim Hoffmeyer, because they said, does the New Testament support the idea of freedom from servanthood, or does everyone have to serve somebody? Which Bob Dylan said. He said, you might be an ambassador to England or France, you might like to gamble, you might like to dance, you might be the heavyweight champion of the world, you might be a socialite with a long string of pearls, but you're going to have to serve somebody.
Mm-hmm. So I think everyone has to serve somebody, yeah. I mean, you could be Caesar, and then you can live under the temporary illusion that you're not serving anyone for your life period.
Or Pharaoh.
Yeah, that's right. So these people who are at the top who think that they're not actually ultimately accountable to God, and we need to realize that everything we own is on loan. We are stewards, and one day we appear before God and we're to give account for everything we do. And just that's the reality.
All right, slave to sin. Slave versus servant in the New Testament. Paul talks about being a slave to sin. Christ has set us free. Were we actually slaves to sin or just servants?
I want to use the word slave everywhere. So with the Old Testament, my preference would be to render all 800 occurrences of the word eved as servant for consistency. And then my preference probably with the New Testament is to render every single occurrence of doulos as slave.
All right, Leviticus 19, 20 through 22. Why is a distinction to be made when a man sleeps with a slave woman versus when he sleeps with a free woman?
So again, this I would read it as because of the hardness of your heart. So Matthew 19, Mark 10, where actually people are in the Old Testament allowed to take these second-tier wives. That's not a good thing, I think, in absolute terms. When you go back to the beginning, you see this is very unideal, and whenever people have done that, there have been consequences.
Okay, Jacob's situation of working for his wives, was that slavery? If so, comparable to the slavery servanthood referenced by Paul?
I mean, in one sense, yes, I think it was slavery. Laban's a very cunning person because he gets at least 1 month's work out of Jacob before they even start negotiating on price. So, he's very keen. You see it back in Genesis 24. When he saw the gold on his sister's arms, he suddenly got, come in to Abraham's servant. So he's got an eye for a deal. And so I think, arguably, he was working somewhat like a slave. Jacob says, "You changed my wages 10 times." There may be some exaggeration there. But that Laban would be a very hard person to work for. But of course, at the same time, Jacob did manage to do far better out of it, both in terms of the family he got and the sheep.
Okay. Someone is really impressed with your brain because they just threw this one passage. How do you explain Deuteronomy 26:68? Now, you cannot explain it because Deuteronomy 26 only has 19 verses. Nailed them.
I'm glad I didn't start on an answer.
How many languages have you read parts of the Bible in? New Testament, Old Testament, whatever.
Maybe about 12.
In a society such as the antebellum South, in which slavery is morally wrong and commonplace, what obligations do Christians have in addressing the problem in society or ending it? Similar question. The slavery that happened in America was an abomination before God and man. People have misinterpreted the Bible in order to gratify their own greed. Something should be made to make this right.
Yep.
And those two together first.
Okay, so, I mean, if you're asking for a Brit for commentary on the Civil War, I'm going to refrain. If you want to know what to make of the Civil War,
let me ask
wait
it
for
this
Judgment
way.
Day.
Here's the question. Oh, that's okay.
Yeah. Then the question is, what obligations do you have? Well,
Yes.
It depends who you are. So if you're able to get political office to change things, then obviously you should do that. The question of whether a particular cause is worth a particular fight, I think one of the things we got with the Civil War is we got complexity of cause. It's not that there's only one thing going on, there's more than one thing going on, and, 600,000 die and so on. I don't want to get drawn into evaluating something. It's obviously a good thing that slavery was abolished. It's obviously a bad thing that 600 people die, And in order to work out something, I don't want to get into the counterfactual. What would have happened if another historical route had gone on for the next 10 or 20 years? I simply don't know. All we know is what happened, and we know that a good end was achieved at a great price.
Last question. What then should we say to the atheists, the Sam Harrises?
Well, I think one of the problems with atheism, many problems, is firstly, what's the value of human life at all? We believe as Christians, as people who follow the Bible, even if you didn't have the New Testament just from following Genesis 1, that every human is in the image of God and therefore of infinite value. And that just goes through everything we do, that we believe that. What value does an atheist put on a person near the end of their life in a nursing home who doesn't have relatives? And the answer is just about nothing. What value does an atheist put at a person at the beginning of their lives, in the womb and so on? And we believe that because everyone is in the image of God, their value is not dependent on their own contribution to society, their own skill and so on, even if they have completely lost their mind. And so there's no personality to involve in because they've got a terrible form of dementia. That person is of infinite value. And that just is so important. And what does an atheist have to counter that? And the other thing is, of course, if we're just going to go in atheism, we're just going to think about, just throwing ourselves into the pleasures of society and materialism and so on, the inevitable product of that is it's going to lead to all sorts of oppression in the whole system. The human trafficking that's going on, so much of it is being fed by the sex industry, which comes basically from a desacralization of sexual behavior, which comes as part of atheism. This is all we are. Why shouldn't we just, indulge in whatever pleasures? That is one of the, it's surely the biggest thing driving human trafficking. And so Christians actually have something to respond positively to that in wanting to actually take away all of the motivation for that sort of thing. So I think we've got a lot to say.
Would you join me in thanking Peter?